On their block in Maplewood, the Hendersons were known, if they were known at all, for their yard. The lawn was not the most verdant nor the most symmetrical, but Walter Henderson, with his square jaw and slightly stooped posture from decades of desk work, had a compulsion about edging the grass just so, as though straight borders might correct the crookedness within. His wife, Elaine, had once been the type of woman who filled flower beds with color. Tulips in spring, lilies in summer, chrysanthemums in the fall, but lately her energy had congealed into something more like inertia. The front porch still bore hanging baskets, but they sagged, and no one in the neighborhood seemed to notice. Or perhaps they noticed and politely refrained from comment, which was worse. The Hendersons looked, to anyone glancing from the sidewalk, like a family in order. 2 children. Matthew, in his senior year of high school, the lean athlete with restless eyes, and his sister Claire, 13, who still bore the soft edges of childhood but was sharpening them with sarcasm. A golden retriever named Daisy. A Subaru Outback in the driveway. They were so nearly an advertisement for middle-class Americanness that it took effort to remember how much had already slipped. Walter worked as a project manager at a mid-tier construction firm, the sort of job that paid enough for the mortgage and left just enough dissatisfaction to ferment at night. He drank 1 beer most evenings, then another, then sometimes a third, though he called it unwinding. Elaine, once a public school teacher, had quit when Matthew was born and never entirely found her way back. She said she might substitute teach, or maybe take a community college class, but in truth she scrolled real estate listings, envying houses with bigger windows and newer kitchens, as if architecture could fix the hollow inside her. Their marriage had begun in earnestness, Walter proposing after a year of earnest dinners and long walks, Elaine imagining she'd never tire of his steadiness, but earnestness, unwatered, calcifies into dullness. They still ate dinner together most nights, but it had become a ritual of silence punctuated by Matthew's half-sarcastic recitations of practice drills and Claire's withering commentary on middle school drama. Claire got a C in math, Matthew said one Thursday, shoveling pasta. Thanks for the update, Claire shot back. Want me to tell them about your college rejection? Elaine cleared her throat, ready to referee, but Walter only chewed slower, staring at his plate as if numbers and futures were abstractions beyond his jurisdiction. It was Elaine who felt the cracks first. They came not as arguments, those had burned out years ago, but as silences. Silences at the dinner table, in the bedroom, in the car. Silences that weren't comfortable but accusatory, reminding her of all that wasn't being said. She began going on walks alone at twilight, when the streetlights flickered on and the neighbors' televisions glowed blue through drawn curtains. She told herself it was for exercise, but really it was for escape. Walter noticed, of course, though not with words. He noticed by the way he turned on the television louder when she was gone, or by how he left the porch light burning, as if to guide her home, though he would be half asleep on the couch by the time she returned. And the children noticed too, though children always notice more than parents imagine. Matthew began staying longer at practice, then at friends' houses, then nowhere in particular. Claire retreated into her phone, her bedroom walls sprouting posters like shields. The Hendersons were still, in the census taker's box, a family. But the center was loosening, and though none of them could articulate it, each felt the tremor of something waiting to collapse. If Walter had a weakness greater than beer, it was nostalgia. He clung to it the way some men clung to their college football teams or their vinyl collections. Nostalgia made the present more bearable because it allowed him to pretend that the best days had already been lived, and if they had been lived, then perhaps he was not entirely to blame for the mediocrity of the now. He remembered Elaine at 25, hair pinned up in the sticky air of a July wedding reception, her laughter so unguarded that he'd felt chosen merely to be the one beside her. He remembered Matthew as a toddler who believed Walter could fix anything, broken toys, stubbed toes, monsters in closets. And Claire, a baby so colicky that nights had been sleepless marathons, but even then he had been necessary, essential. Now, necessity was the one currency he seemed to lack. At work, his colleagues were younger, more fluent in project management software, less patient with his habit of printing out spreadsheets to mark them up by hand. At home, Elaine made decisions without consulting him. Small ones, like buying a new rug, and larger ones, like planning Claire's orthodontist appointments. Matthew no longer asked for rides. He had friends, a girlfriend even, though Walter only knew her name from a crumpled permission slip left on the counter. Walter told himself that this was the natural erosion of family life, that children were supposed to grow away, that marriages were supposed to quiet, that work was supposed to lose its shine. But telling himself this did not still the gnawing. Elaine, meanwhile, was engaged in a private rebellion of her own. It began innocuously, an online book club she joined for mental stimulation. But soon she was messaging late into the night with a man named David, a dentist from Oregon who quoted Rilke and asked about her dreams. She told herself it was harmless, that nothing physical was possible across 2 time zones, that she deserved a pocket of tenderness. What startled her was not how much she looked forward to his messages, but how little guilt she felt afterward. One evening, as Walter watched a cable news anchor drone about infrastructure bills, Elaine sat beside him on the couch, phone in hand, suppressing a smile. She typed, "Sometimes I feel invisible in my own home." David's reply came quick, "Then let me see you." Walter glanced at her then, mistaking her flush for the glow of the television. Matthew was living his own double life. To his parents, he was the college-bound senior navigating applications. To himself, he was already halfway gone. He spent weekends with his girlfriend Jenna, whose parents were liberal in ways that made his own seem prehistoric. Jenna's house had wine with dinner, conversations about climate change, and an aura of possibility. With Jenna, he spoke about leaving Maplewood, about studying environmental science, about never mowing a lawn again. With his parents, he spoke less and less, offering only the minimum required to keep suspicion at bay. Claire's rebellion was smaller but sharper. She posted memes about dysfunctional families, disguised as jokes but aimed like knives. She locked her bedroom door, a tiny fortress against the world, where she curated playlists about heartbreak she hadn't yet lived but fully anticipated. At school, teachers described her as bright but distracted. At home, she was simply absent, even when sitting at the same table. The Henderson house itself began to mirror them. A leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom went unrepaired. The porch paint peeled. The yard that had once been Walter's pride grew patchy. The physical decline was subtle, but to Elaine it was glaring. Evidence that their lives were less curated than their neighbors', evidence that she was trapped in a narrative of slow decay. One night, during dinner, Claire announced without looking up from her phone, "Jenna's parents are taking her to Europe this summer." "Good for Jenna," Elaine said automatically. "Must be nice," Matthew added, his tone both wistful and accusatory. Walter set down his fork. "Not every family can afford Europe." "No," Matthew said. "Some families just afford silence." The remark hung there, heavier than the steam from the casserole. Elaine's hand twitched toward Matthew, then fell. Walter stared at his son, but the boy's face was impassive, already withdrawing. That night Elaine lay awake, listening to Walter's snores, wondering when exactly the house had become a mausoleum of unspoken things. She imagined herself leaving, packing a bag, driving until the highway signs became unfamiliar. She imagined the relief of not having to cook dinners that no one praised, of not having to referee conversations that weren't conversations at all. And then she imagined the wreckage. Claire's wide-eyed hurt, Matthew's cold anger, Walter's confusion. The images clashed, leaving her restless. In the dark, Walter stirred. "You okay?" he mumbled. "Fine," she said, but neither of them believed it. The summer arrived with its usual insistence, bringing heat and a sense of urgency that made every argument sharper, every silence heavier. Walter found himself sweating under his dress shirts at the office, his mind oscillating between deadlines and the subtle collapses of his household. He'd started noticing the way Elaine lingered by the window, phone in hand, or how Matthew's eyes darted around corners, as if rehearsing escape routes. Claire's laughter, when it appeared, was brittle. Elaine's online correspondence with David deepened. It wasn't just small talk anymore. It was a slow excavation of her dissatisfaction, a confession of yearning that she didn't dare voice to Walter. Sometimes she read his messages aloud, just to hear the cadence of someone who understood her hidden complexities. Walter, absorbed in spreadsheets and emails, noticed only her occasional smile and assumed it was something mundane, a memory or a trivial amusement. Matthew received a letter from his dream college. He tore it open on the kitchen counter, and Elaine, in her half-conscious maternal state, caught the expression that passed across his face, an odd mix of triumph and emptiness. He wasn't angry or sad. He was simply elsewhere, already projecting himself into a world that didn't include the Henderson home as it was. That night, the family gathered for dinner, an increasingly ceremonial act of pretense. Walter carved the chicken with mechanical precision. Elaine poured the wine. Claire fiddled with the butter dish as if it contained secrets. Matthew stared at his plate. The conversation flitted between topics that no one cared about: school events, traffic, weather. But the undercurrent of discontent hummed beneath every syllable. "I'm thinking about taking an internship this summer," Matthew said finally. "That's good," Elaine replied, too quickly. "But it means leaving earlier than I thought," he added, not looking at anyone. Walter's knife paused mid-slice. "Earlier? How early?" "Next week," Matthew said, calm, almost rehearsed. Elaine swallowed. The words settled like stones in her stomach. Next week. That was immediate. That was sudden. That was everything unraveling. Claire snorted. "He's not staying for dinner anyway." Her voice, sharp and unfiltered, was a dagger aimed at the illusion of togetherness. Walter opened his mouth, closed it. He had no answers for this kind of truth. Elaine, meanwhile, was plotting a subtler rebellion. She signed up for a weekend retreat advertised as a women's wellness experience, a euphemism she barely understood but felt drawn to. She imagined floating away in meditation, ignoring the family for a few days, seeing herself in a reflection that wasn't tarnished by unspoken resentments. Walter did not protest. He was too busy staring at his hands, imagining the spreadsheets that might be waiting for him in the morning, imagining Matthew gone, Claire silent. The retreat, when it arrived, was both balm and revelation. Elaine met women who had quietly revolted against their own stagnation. Mothers who had left their husbands, daughters who had rejected expectations, women who had embraced lives their families didn't approve of. Conversations were punctuated with laughter and tears, each revelation peeling layers off Elaine she hadn't known were still stuck. She returned home with a sense of freedom tempered by guilt, an understanding that the Hendersons' house was both a prison and a comfort, and that love, if it existed here, was complicated. Meanwhile, Matthew and Claire had their own quiet revolutions. Matthew's internship pulled him into a city that smelled of ambition and possibility. He returned on weekends, but his distance had grown, and he measured interactions in minutes rather than hours. Claire, observing her brother's absence and her mother's newfound assertiveness, began testing limits she had never challenged before, staying out later, pushing boundaries with friends, even experimenting with makeup and fashion choices that Elaine hadn't sanctioned. Walter, the least mobile in terms of rebellion, found himself retreating into nostalgia again, but now with sharper edges. He started writing letters he would never send, to the children he could no longer reach, to Elaine, whose presence in the house was increasingly enigmatic. He cleaned the garage obsessively, reorganized his files, and sometimes, late at night, he sat in the dark living room and imagined conversations that would never happen. By the time autumn rolled around, the Hendersons were living together in a house that was full but empty, a space that was simultaneously familiar and alien. The yard was unkempt. The porch light burned late into the night. The family dinners continued, but each member was performing a role, practicing civility while quietly counting down the minutes until they could escape into their private worlds. And yet, there were small threads of connection that persisted. Elaine would sometimes brush Claire's hair back from her face. Matthew would bring home coffee from the city. Walter would laugh, briefly, almost absurdly, at something Claire said. These moments were fragile, fleeting, but they suggested that even in the slow collapse of a family, life continued, stitched together with both longing and remorse. The first frost of the year came quietly, icing the edges of the maple leaves and giving the Hendersons' street a brittle, transient beauty. Inside the house, The air smelled faintly of cinnamon from a candle Elaine had bought at the retreat. She was alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with precision, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, thinking about everything that had shifted over the past months. Walter wandered in, drawn by the sound of movement, and for a moment, they simply stood in silence, two bodies in the same space, both aware of absence and presence in equal measure. Quote, "You're home early," Elaine said, not looking up. "Traffic," Walter replied. It was true in a literal sense, but the metaphorical layers were thick. Traffic in life, traffic in understanding, traffic in the slow passage of children leaving and love slipping sideways. Matthew had returned from the city for a weekend visit. He had changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable. A confidence, a cynicism, a smile that carried more calculation than innocence. He greeted Walter with a nod, Elaine with a hug, Claire with a playful shove. The house felt crowded but quieter somehow, as if everyone was negotiating the space carefully, aware that the old rhythms no longer applied. Dinner that night was a tense choreography. Elaine spoke sparingly, Walter asked routine questions about school and work, Matthew responded politely, Claire made quips that occasionally landed like stones on the table. Yet amidst the awkwardness, there was a strange cohesion, a sense that the family could, for brief periods, coexist without fracturing entirely. After dinner, Elaine suggested they all watch a movie together, something light, something nostalgic. The children reluctantly agreed. They gathered on the couch, Daisy settling between Walter and Claire, and for an hour, the house was filled with laughter, popcorn crunching, the flicker of the screen casting warm shadows. It was ephemeral, almost painfully so, but it reminded them that connection was still possible. Later, when Matthew had returned to his room and Claire had gone to text her friends, Walter and Elaine sat in the living room, the candle now low. Walter reached for her hand, tentative. She allowed it. No words were necessary. The silence held the weight of acknowledgement, regret, hope, and quiet endurance. The Hendersons were still fractured. There were arguments to come, silences to endure, disappointments yet to be faced. Yet in that moment, they existed in the possibility of repair, however fragile. Franzen would have called it messy, human, unavoidable, a portrait not of perfection, but of life itself, with all its contradictions and minute beauties. And so the house on Maplewood Street remained a home, a theater of small victories and failures, a vessel carrying the slow, stubborn pulse of a family that refused to dissolve entirely, even when every internal current urged it toward collapse. The night deepened. Outside, the frost glimmered under the streetlights. Inside, the Hendersons sat together, almost as if by will alone, proving that even in the face of quiet despair, connection, no matter how fleeting, persisted. Winter deepened, bringing with it early nights and a pervasive gray that seemed to seep into every corner of the Henderson home. The children, now almost fully aware of the distance that had grown between them and their parents, moved like shadows through the house. Claire had taken to occupying the small attic room, its slanted ceiling and single frosted window creating a world apart. Matthew, increasingly absorbed in his internship and college plans, spoke to no one but Elaine when necessary. Walter found himself lingering in the garage, tinkering with projects he had started years ago and never completed, as if fixing old shelves could patch the fissures in his family. Elaine, feeling both liberated and guilty from her retreat experiences, began documenting her days in a small leather journal. She wrote about Walter's nostalgia, Matthew's ambition, Claire's sarcastic wit, and her own longing for identity beyond motherhood and marriage. Writing became a mirror, reflecting both her frustrations and her remaining love. She often caught Walter watching her, a mixture of suspicion and quiet longing in his eyes. Neither knew how to bridge the gap that had widened with time, yet both were unwilling to abandon the faint hope of connection. One evening, a snowstorm trapped the family indoors. Power flickered, then went out completely, leaving them huddled around the fireplace. The darkness, which might have been oppressive, instead loosened their tongues. Matthew recounted stories from his internship, exaggerating small mishaps. Claire mocked him good-naturedly. Walter chuckled at Elaine's retorts. For the first time in months, The household felt slightly unified, a fragile bubble against the storm. Yet the harmony was temporary. When the fire dwindled and the storm raged outside, conversations faltered, and unspoken grievances resurfaced. Matthew muttered about his college anxieties, Claire complained about the monotony of home, Walter regretted not having achieved more, and Elaine, overwhelmed by the rawness of their voices, retreated to the kitchen to warm tea that no one drank. The snowstorm passed, leaving a white blanket across the neighborhood, pristine and deceptive. The Hendersons stepped outside the next morning, each silently acknowledging that the fleeting moments of connection during the storm did not erase the ongoing tensions, only illuminated how deeply entrenched they were. Spring approached, a tentative promise of renewal, though the cracks in the Hendersons' lives remained. Matthew had received acceptance letters from several universities. Instead of celebrating, he vacillated, fearing that leaving home would create a void he could not fill, though the home itself was already a void in many ways. Claire, on the cusp of teenage independence, began exploring art classes and local theater, finding a refuge outside the stifling routine of the house. Walter considered retirement earlier than planned, haunted by the sense that he had been a spectator in his own life. He spent more evenings on the porch, watching the neighborhood, imagining parallel lives where he had spoken more, loved more, and fixed less mundane things but more meaningful ones. Elaine, recognizing the growing divergence of their children's lives from the home she had curated, started involving herself in volunteer work, finding a purpose outside the family that gave her both satisfaction and perspective. The climax came subtly, without fireworks or shouting. One Sunday, Elaine, Walter, Matthew, and Claire sat down for brunch. Real brunch this time, not the rushed dinners of winter. The conversation began hesitantly, then opened. Matthew confessed fears about leaving, Claire shared worries about being misunderstood, Walter admitted to regrets he had never voiced, and Elaine spoke about loneliness and longing. No one solved everything, no one erased past grievances, but they began to see each other clearly, not just as roles in a household, but as flawed, striving humans. The final scene of the story is quiet. A spring breeze carries the scent of lilacs through the open windows. The Hendersons sit together, fragmented yet intact, aware of the fragility of what binds them but willing, for the moment, to endure it. Love is not triumphant, happiness is not absolute, but survival, the daily act of remaining present for one another, has become a modest, precious victory. As the narrative closes, it leaves the family suspended between hope and imperfection, a true reflection of the delicate balance Jonathan Franzen captures so well. That families are both tender and destructive, and that the slow collapse is often accompanied by moments of unexpected grace. Summer arrived again, but it was different this time. The house on Maplewood Street seemed to exhale, the weight of winters and springs past pressing less heavily on its walls. The Hendersons, each shaped by the slow unraveling of months and years, had begun to recognize the fragile threads that still tied them together. Matthew was preparing to leave for college. His room, once cluttered with the detritus of adolescence, comic books, half-finished model airplanes, posters peeling at the corners, was now meticulously organized, a reflection of the young man he had become. He moved quietly through the house, conscious of the gravity of departure, aware that leaving meant both freedom and a subtle loss that could not be measured in words. Claire, now fully embracing her teenage self, had painted a mural in her attic room, bright and chaotic, an emblem of her independence. Yet she had left space for Walter and Elaine's approval, a silent acknowledgement that even rebellion needed roots. Elaine had emerged from her periods of retreat and introspection with a tempered strength. She still wrote in her journal, but now she shared pieces of it with Walter, fragments that invited dialogue rather than judgment. She had begun volunteering at a community center, finding a sense of purpose beyond the home, a bridge between self and family that had previously seemed impossible. Walter, whose nostalgia had once been a retreat from reality, had started to confront it. He repaired the leaky faucet, repainted the porch, and, in the quiet hours of the evening, began addressing the letters he had written to his children, unsent, unread, an act of acknowledgement more than communication. It was an attempt, however small, to reclaim some agency over the family he feared he had failed. The family gathered one evening in the living room, a rare convergence of all four, plus Daisy nestled at their feet. Conversation flowed, uneven and occasionally awkward, yet present. Matthew shared a story from his internship, Claire recounted a recent theater rehearsal, and Elaine and Walter listened, responding in ways that were both tentative and genuine. There were pauses, still too many, but the silences were no longer weighted with accusation. They were simply spaces for breathing, for reflection. As night fell, Walter and Elaine watched their children retreat to their rooms, aware that the house would soon feel quieter, emptier. Yet they also knew that something had shifted. The recognition of mutual flaws and the willingness to witness them without retreating. It was not reconciliation in the grandiose sense, nor was it triumph. It was, simply, endurance, a fragile, human victory. The story closes with the family standing briefly on the porch, watching the sunset cast long shadows over Maplewood Street. The golden light reflected in the frost still lingering from early spring mornings, blending with the warmth of indoor lamps. In that moment, the Hendersons were neither wholly broken nor perfectly united. They were a family in flux, a testament to the slow collapse and subtle repair that define ordinary lives. And perhaps, in that delicate balance, there existed a quiet, sustaining hope.